There's a quiet truth we don't talk about enough. One day, the people you rely on most may not be there. Not because they don't love you, but because life changes. Children grow up and move away. Friends get busy with their own storms. Partners leave, sometimes by choice, sometimes by fate. And in those moments when the noise fades and the house falls silent, you might find yourself face to face with something many of us quietly fear, growing older alone. But what if that silence isn't something to dread? What if it's actually an invitation to come home to yourself, to discover a deeper peace you didn't know you were capable of? In Buddhism, the Buddha taught that clinging is the root of suffering. That includes our clinging to permanence, to people, to expectations. Today, I want to walk with you through what it really means to age with wisdom, not fear, to find strength in solitude and clarity in impermanence. If you're someone who's starting to think about what comes next in life, or maybe you're already feeling the slow shifts, emotionally, physically, socially, please stay with me. Every part of what we'll explore builds towards something that matters deeply. Don't skip ahead. Don't miss the pieces that might speak directly to something in you that you've been quietly holding. And hey, if you find comfort or clarity in this kind of reflection, if you appreciate this little space we've created to slow down and breathe together, there's a simple, free favor I'll ask. Hit the subscribe button. It helps this community grow, and it means we can keep holding this space for others who need it just like you. Let's begin. There's something we all do without even realizing it. We build our lives around things that feel solid, our routines, our homes, the people we love, and we hold on to this deep, quiet belief that if we just keep everything in place, we'll be okay, that tomorrow will look like today, that our relationships will stay the same, that the stability we've created will last. It's comforting, isn't it? That illusion of permanence. But then, something shifts. A loved one gets sick, a job ends, a relationship changes. And suddenly, the ground underneath us feels less steady. It's a feeling that catches us off guard because even though we know life changes, we often live as if it won't. This is what the Buddha called anicca, impermanence. It's not just a distant spiritual idea, it's the foundation of life itself. Everything is always changing. Our bodies, our relationships, our thoughts, our circumstances, nothing stays fixed. And yet we cling, not because we're foolish, but because we're human. We want to feel safe, we want to believe that what we love won't slip away. But the Buddha reminded us that clinging to what is temporary is what causes suffering, not the change itself, but our resistance to it. That's what keeps us stuck, anxious, afraid. I remember speaking with a woman named Marie, who had been married for over 40 years. Her husband David took care of everything, bills, appointments, all the little details that kept life running. She focused on the home, their kids, their life together. They were a team, and it worked. But when David passed away suddenly, Marie wasn't just grieving the loss of her partner. She was also overwhelmed by the practical reality that she didn't know how to navigate life alone. "I trusted him completely," she told me. "I never thought I'd have to do this part on my own." That moment was heartbreaking, not just because of the grief, but because of the fear. The fear of not knowing where things were, who to call, how to manage. That's the kind of pain that happens when we build our sense of security on the idea that someone else will always be there. Buddhism doesn't ask us to stop trusting others or to live in fear, but it does invite us to wake up, to see clearly, to realize that preparing ourselves, not just financially but emotionally and spiritually, is one of the deepest forms of self-compassion. It's not about becoming paranoid or overly cautious, it's about practicing awareness. Knowing where important documents are, being familiar with how things work in your household, having conversations about the future while things are still calm, and most importantly, building a sense of inner stability that doesn't collapse when the outer world shifts. In Buddhism, this is the heart of mindfulness, being awake in the present moment, not asleep in assumptions. The Buddha said, "You yourself must strive." The Buddhas only point the way. That means this path, this life, is ours to walk. Others can walk beside us, but no one else can carry us forever. It's up to us to develop the strength to meet life as it is, not just as we wish it would be. And that strength doesn't come from controlling everything. It comes from knowing that whatever happens, we have the tools inside us to respond with clarity, grace, and presence. There's something almost comforting about believing we know where life is headed. We make plans, we set routines, we imagine what the future will look like, and then we begin to rely on those expectations. We say things like, "Once I retire, I'll finally relax," or "I'll have time to travel once the kids are grown," or even, "We've got everything in place just like we planned." But life doesn't always follow our script, does it? Sometimes it tears up the script completely and hands us a blank page, and when that happens, it can shake us to our core. The Buddha taught that suffering arises not because life is painful, but because we resist its natural uncertainty. This concept is deeply tied to dukkha, the unsatisfactoriness or stress that comes from expecting life to be something it's not. And let's be honest, we've all done it. We've all placed our peace in the hands of assumptions, that our loved ones will always be there, that our health will stay strong, that tomorrow will look much like today. When those assumptions crumble, it's not just the situation that hurts, it's the fact that we never saw it coming. Let me share the story of Carol. She was one of those people who always had things under control. Married for over 30 years, she and her husband Peter had built a life that seemed steady and reliable. He handled the finances and paperwork, while she kept the home and cared for their grandkids. They talked often about retirement, about buying a little place near the beach, about growing old together. But one afternoon, Peter collapsed at work, a sudden heart attack. There was no warning, no time to prepare. And just like that, Carol's world changed. In the days and weeks that followed, she was lost, not just in grief, but in practical confusion. She didn't know the logins to their accounts. She couldn't find the insurance documents. She didn't know who their lawyer was or even how much they had in savings. Everything she thought was secure suddenly felt like quicksand. She told me, "I always assumed we'd have more time, that we'd figure it all out together. But now I feel like I'm waking up in a life I don't recognize." This is the reality of the unexpected. And it's not just Carol's story. It's a very human experience. Buddhism doesn't promise to take away the pain of life, but it does offer a path through it. The Buddha taught that clinging to how we think things should be only deepens our suffering. But when we accept the nature of change, when we stop fighting what is, we begin to find peace, even in the storm. So what does that mean for us? It means acknowledging that life is unpredictable and preparing not out of fear, but out of love. It means not waiting until something breaks to learn how it works. It means asking the difficult questions now so that we're not left searching in the dark later. The Buddha used the metaphor of a raft, something we build to carry us across the river. But we have to build it before the flood, not during it. Carol in time began to rebuild. She reached out to a financial advisor, asked for help, learned the systems her husband used to manage. She started meditating in the mornings, just 10 minutes at first. "I needed something to anchor me," she said. Everything else felt like it was spinning. Slowly, that inner strength started to grow. And what was once terrifying began to feel manageable. Not because her life went back to the way it was, but because she began meeting it with awareness rather than resistance. There's a moment in life when you start to notice little shifts. Maybe it's the way your knees ache a bit more in the morning, or how your energy dips earlier in the day. Maybe it's forgetting names that used to come easily, or needing more rest than you did a few years ago. These changes are quiet at first, almost easy to brush off, but over time they become harder to ignore. And that's when it hits you. Life really is moving forward. Aging isn't just something that happens to other people anymore. It's here. And with it comes a question that few of us truly want to face. Am I prepared? The truth is, most of us spend years preparing for everything except the one thing that's guaranteed: change. We prepare for careers, for raising families, for buying homes. But when it comes to preparing for the later stages of life, physically, emotionally, spiritually, we tend to push it aside. Sometimes it's because we're busy. Sometimes it's because we don't want to think about it. And sometimes deep down it's because we're scared. But Buddhism invites us to see preparation not as a burden, but as a form of compassion for ourselves and for those who love us. The Buddha spoke often about samsara, the cycle of birth, aging, illness, and death, not to frighten us, but to remind us that change is not the enemy. It's the nature of existence. When we resist that truth, we suffer. But when we embrace it with wisdom, we create space for peace. I once had a friend named David who embodied this lesson in a way I'll never forget. David had done everything right. He was a successful businessman, healthy, organized, and financially stable. He had a retirement plan, good insurance, and a strong community. But when he was diagnosed with a chronic illness in his late 60s, none of those things could shield him from the emotional weight of losing his independence. He told me, "I prepared for retirement, not for being vulnerable." And that stuck with me. Because that's where so many of us find ourselves. We prepare for comfort, but not for discomfort. We prepare for freedom, but not for limitations. David's journey became less about managing his assets and more about managing his mind. He started attending a local meditation group. He read Buddhist texts about acceptance and letting go. He began practicing mindfulness, not to escape his condition, but to meet it with clarity. "Some days are still hard," he told me, "but now I'm not fighting the truth. I'm learning to live with it." That's what real preparation looks like. Not just organizing our papers or securing our finances, but strengthening our hearts for the inevitable uncertainties ahead. Buddhism teaches us to prepare for life's transitions the way we would for a long journey, not with fear, but with presence. We gather the tools we need, we lighten our emotional load, we let go of the illusion of control and instead build resilience, and that resilience doesn't come from ignoring what's ahead. It comes from turning toward it, gently but steadily. So what can that look like for you? Maybe it means finally having that difficult conversation about future care. Maybe it's learning more about your health or simplifying your life so that your energy goes toward what truly matters. Maybe it's starting a meditation practice, not because things are falling apart, but because you want to meet whatever comes with a calm, steady mind. It's a beautiful idea, isn't it? That no matter what happens in life, the people we love will be there. We grow up believing in that kind of support, that family means forever, that friends will drop everything when we need them, that we won't have to face the hardest parts of life alone. And for some that's true, at least for a while. But life, in its unpredictable and often painful honesty, doesn't always work out the way we hoped it would. Sometimes the people we expect to lean on simply can't carry us, not because they don't care, but because they have their own storms to weather. That realization can be heartbreaking. I've heard it from so many people over the years, people who raised children with love and sacrifice, believing that when the time came, those same children would be close, supportive, ready to help. But then the time comes and the response isn't what they imagined. Maybe the kids live in another city. Maybe they're overwhelmed with their own families, jobs, responsibilities. Maybe they love deeply but show it from a distance. And that gap between expectation and reality, it hurts. Buddhism has a way of gently pulling us out of that pain, not by pretending it doesn't exist, but by helping us see it with fresh eyes. One of the Buddha's core teachings is that attachment is the root of suffering. That includes attachment to roles, relationships, and especially expectations. We're allowed to love people fully, but when we tie our peace to how we expect them to show up for us, we put our emotional well-being in their hands. And the truth is, even the most loving people can't always meet those expectations. I remember a woman named Martha who told me her story over a cup of tea one afternoon. She had 3 grown children and had been the emotional glue of her family for decades. Holidays were always at her house. She was the one who called, reminded, supported, and held everything together. So when she fell and needed help recovering, she naturally assumed her children would step in. But one was across the country, one had young kids, and the third was dealing with mental health struggles. No one came. Not because they didn't love her, but because they genuinely couldn't. And that hurt more than the fall itself. At first, Martha felt abandoned. Then she felt angry. But slowly, through Buddhist study and reflection, something shifted. She began to see that her suffering came not from what her children did or didn't do, but from the weight of her expectations. She was holding on to a story that they should be there in a certain way. And when reality didn't match, she felt broken. Buddhism taught her that love doesn't mean control, and freedom doesn't mean being alone, it means being emotionally independent. With time, Martha began building a new kind of support. She reached out to her local community centre, joined a seniors group, and connected with neighbours she had never really spoken to before. She even hired a caregiver a few times a week. It wasn't what she imagined, but it was what she needed. And in that shift, she discovered something unexpected, a sense of peace that didn't depend on anyone else's schedule, availability, or approval. The Buddha reminded us that while relationships are sacred, they are also impermanent. People come and go, roles evolve, and even the closest bonds can change. But that doesn't mean love disappears. It just takes new forms. When we stop clinging to how things should be, we make space for how they are. And in that space we find freedom, not from connection, but from the suffering that comes when we expect people to carry more than they can. There's a kind of quiet that only shows up when life shifts, when the house that was once full of voices slowly falls into stillness. It might be after a partner passes away, or when the kids move out, or when friends begin to drift into their own worlds. Suddenly, what used to be a home filled with conversation, laughter, or even just background noise becomes silent. And in that silence, we're faced with something we're not often taught how to handle: being alone. Not for a weekend, not by choice, but as a daily part of life. For many, this kind of solitude feels more like emptiness. It's easy to start believing that being alone is the same as being lonely. And in a society that constantly celebrates togetherness, activity, and being social, that belief gets reinforced. We're taught that to be alone is to be forgotten, to be left behind. But Buddhism offers us a radically different view, one that doesn't fear solitude, but honors it. The Buddha himself sought solitude throughout his life. Before his enlightenment, he left behind a royal life to wander alone, to sit in stillness, to listen not to the noise of the world, but to the truth within. In those quiet hours beneath the Bodhi tree, surrounded by nothing but nature and his own breath, he found what most of us are still searching for: clarity, peace, and freedom from suffering. Solitude wasn't the obstacle, it was the doorway. I remember a man named Henry who experienced this transformation in his own way. He had been married for over 50 years. His wife was his best friend, his partner in everything. When she passed, the silence that filled their home felt unbearable. He told me once, the hardest part wasn't the grief, it was the echo, the absence of her voice in the room. At first, he tried to fill the space with noise, TV, music, distractions. But none of it worked. The emptiness was still there, waiting for him. Eventually, Henry stopped trying to escape it. He began sitting quietly each morning with a cup of tea, looking out the window, breathing. He started reading about mindfulness and practicing simple meditation. At first it felt like nothing was happening, he said, but over time the silence started to feel less like a void and more like a friend. This is what solitude can become when we stop resisting it. In Buddhism, solitude isn't something to fear, it's something to be embraced as a sacred space, a place where we can reconnect with ourselves, not the roles we've played, not the people we've served, but the person we truly are underneath it all. When we're alone, we begin to hear ourselves more clearly. We notice the patterns in our thoughts, the stories we've carried, the emotions that have gone unspoken, and in that noticing, there's healing. We begin to ask deeper questions. What matters to me now? What brings me joy in this chapter of life? What parts of myself have I ignored while caring for everyone else? These aren't questions we can answer in a rush. They need stillness, they need space. The Buddha taught that peace comes from within, not from things, not from others, not from constant activity, but from awareness, from turning inward, from being present with what is. And solitude offers us that space to turn inward without distraction. It's not about isolating ourselves. It's about discovering that even when no one else is around, we are still whole, still complete, still enough. So if you're finding yourself more quiet than you're used to, take a breath. Maybe that quiet isn't here to punish you. Maybe it's here to teach you, to show you parts of yourself that got lost in the noise of life. Maybe, just maybe, this season of solitude is your invitation to come home, not to a place, but to yourself. Many of us build our lives believing things will stay the same, that the people we love will always be nearby, that we'll stay strong and steady. But life, as the Buddha said, is always changing, and our suffering comes from resisting that change. What if we stopped clinging to the idea that everything should stay familiar? What if we prepared, with love and wisdom, for the reality that it won't? The good news is, we can. We can start now. Not in fear, but in peace. We can organize our lives, strengthen our minds, and open our hearts to the truth of impermanence. That's where true freedom lives. No matter where life takes you or who walks beside you, remember this. Peace is already within you, quiet, steady, and always waiting to be heard. You are not behind. You are not forgotten. You are right where your next chapter begins. If this message touched something in you, I invite you to keep going. Watch one of the videos on your screen now. It might be the next step your heart has been looking for. Thank you for being part of the Buddhist journey. Until next time, may you walk gently, live mindfully, and rest in the truth that you are never truly alone.